Walter Hayes had lived through 73 long, punishing years, and each one of them weighed on him as heavily as the duffel bag he dragged behind him when he arrived at the outskirts of town, standing before the rusted shack he had just bought with the last remnants of his pension. The structure looked more like a forgotten relic than a home. Its tin roof bowed inward as if caving under the burden of old memories. Its wooden walls warped and blistered from too many seasons of harsh sun and relentless rain, and its windows so clouded with grime they barely reflected the world outside. Yet Walter stood before it with a kind of weary acceptance, the quiet resignation of a man who no longer searched for comfort, but simply needed a place where no one could throw him out, question him, or pity him. Beside him sat Scout, his loyal German shepherd, the one constant thread in a life unraveling at the edges. Scout's coat gleamed with a health that didn't match Walter's own ragged appearance, and the dog's amber eyes scanned the shack with an intensity that suggested he already sensed something hidden beneath the decay. Walter knelt down slowly, knees popping from old injuries earned in deserts and mountain valleys far from home, and scratched behind Scout's ears. "Well, boy," he murmured, voice thick with gravel, "it ain't much, but it's ours." Scout leaned into his touch, offering silent reassurance. The bond between them ran deeper than companionship. It had been forged through nights when Walter woke shaking from memories he couldn't control, and Scout nudged against him until his breathing slowed. Through days when they marched through towns without a friend in the world, and through moments when Walter wondered why he'd survived war only to return to a life that felt equally battle-scarred. The shack sat on a plot of land more wild than maintained, tall grass whispering against their legs as a cold wind drifted in from the woods behind the property. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and old secrets, and though Walter didn't yet know why, he felt a strange pull toward the place, as though unseen threads of fate had been quietly guiding him here. With one last look at the sky streaked with evening gold, he stepped forward, Scout padding beside him. The front door protested loudly as he pushed it open, its hinges screeching like something long dormant being awakened. Dust motes swirled in the fading light, dancing in lazy spirals that revealed how untouched the interior had remained for years. The shack was one room, cramped and cluttered with old furniture left behind by whoever had lived there last. A sagging sofa covered in a white sheet, a table with one broken leg, and a cracked mirror leaning against the wall that reflected their silhouettes like ghosts. But the silence was what struck Walter most. It wasn't the empty silence of an abandoned building, but a heavy, lingering quiet that felt almost purposeful, like a breath held for decades. He set his duffel down with a soft thud and took a slow step forward, the wooden planks creaking beneath his boots. "Could use some work," he muttered, though his tone suggested he was convincing himself more than Scout. The dog sniffed the floor, ears perked, tail stiff, not with aggression, but with the alertness of an animal detecting something humans could not. Walter noticed but brushed it off. Scout was always sharp, always attentive. After years together, the veteran trusted the dog's instincts more than his own, yet today he was too tired to dwell on it. The weight of his journey pressed down on his shoulders, reminding him of the dozens of nights he'd slept under open skies, the motel rooms he'd been forced to leave when rent rose beyond what his pension could afford, and the long-standing ache of being a man who spent more time with memories than with people. He lowered himself onto the dusty sofa, feeling the springs groan beneath him, and let out a breath that trembled on its way out. Scout didn't rest. The shepherd paced the length of the room, nails tapping softly against the floorboards as he sniffed corners and paused to stare at the far end of the shack where the wall met the ground. Walter watched him with mild curiosity, noting how the dog's posture shifted. The lowered head, the stiffened back, the quiet, intent gaze fixed on something unseen. "What's getting you worked up, boy?" Walter asked, though he already sensed that Scout's instincts had latched onto something real. The dog's tail flicked, not wagging, but communicating urgency. Walter followed his gaze and squinted into the dimly lit corner. Nothing looked unusual, Just more peeling wallpaper, a few old nails jutting from the baseboard, and a patch of dusty floor that had clearly been undisturbed for years. Yet Scout stayed rooted to the spot, staring, breathing steadily. Walter pushed himself up with a groan and walked toward the corner, each step slow, thoughtful, the way soldiers move when entering uncertain territory. Scout shifted aside slightly, but remained close, watching every movement. Walter knelt, pressing his palm against the floor. The wood felt cool, colder than the rest of the room. He frowned, knocking his knuckles against it lightly. The sound was off, hollow. As he leaned closer, he noticed something he had missed before, a thin, almost imperceptible seam in the floorboards, a line too straight to be natural, a line that didn't belong. He felt Scout's breath beside his ear, felt the dog's anticipation, and for the first time since stepping into the shack, a shiver traced Walter's spine. Something was beneath them, something the world had long forgotten, something the shack had kept hidden beneath dust and silence. And Scout, with instincts sharpened by loyalty and something deeper, had sensed it from the moment they walked in. Walter didn't yet know what they had found or how profoundly it would unravel the quiet life he'd planned for this place. But as he ran his thumb along the seam and felt the faint give of a hidden latch, he knew this shack, this land, this creaking, forgotten corner of the world held a story waiting for him, and that whatever lay beneath would shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew about the man he once was, the promises he'd carried across decades, and the ghosts he believed he hid. Ad left buried in the past. Walter didn't sleep much that first night in the rusted shack, not because of the thin cot or the draft creeping through the cracks in the walls, but because Scout remained restless long after the moon climbed into the sky. The German shepherd lay near the corner with the hidden seam, his head up, ears alert, eyes never drifting from that section of floor, as though he feared that if he blinked, something important would slip back into the shadows. Walter had long ago learned to trust the dog's instincts. They had saved his life more than once. But tonight, he tried to convince himself that Scout was merely unsettled by the unfamiliar environment. Still, the unease in his gut told him otherwise. When dawn finally crept in through the grimy windows, painting the room in muted gray light, Scout rose immediately, tail stiff, body tense with renewed urgency. Walter rubbed his face, dragging himself from the cot with slow, aching motions, every joint stiff from the cold night air. All right, boy," he muttered as Scout nudged him insistently toward the corner. "We'll look again." He grabbed the lantern he had used the night before, its small flame flickering weakly as he lit it, and knelt down once more beside the seam in the floorboards. This time, with clearer eyes and steadier hands, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a faint set of scratch marks circling the edge of the trapdoor, nearly invisible beneath years of dust, as though someone had once clawed at it in desperation or urgency. A quiet chill ran down his spine. Walter hooked his fingers under the seam and pulled. The wood protested with a low groan, cracking slightly before giving way, revealing the shadowy outline of a narrow staircase leading into darkness thick enough to swallow the lantern's glow. Scout leaned forward and sniffed the air rising from below, then looked up at Walter with expectant eyes. "You want to go down there?" Walter whispered, the words barely audible above the pounding of his heart. Scout didn't wag his tail. He simply stood firm, steady, resolute. That was enough of an answer. Walter lowered the lantern first, watching the light spill over dirt walls, wooden steps, and an eerie stillness that made the hair on his arms rise. Taking a slow, careful breath, he began descending, gripping the wall for balance as the staircase creaked beneath his weight. Scout followed closely, paws silent on the old wood, his presence a steady reassurance in the suffocating quiet. The air grew cooler the deeper they went, carrying with it the scent of old earth and something else, something metallic, faint but undeniable. When they reached the bottom, Walter lifted the lantern higher, revealing a small underground room preserved as though time had deliberately avoided it. Dust blanketed every surface, yet nothing had been disturbed. No sign of intruders, no evidence of time's erosion beyond the natural aging of objects untouched for decades. Against the far wall hung old photographs, black and white images of a family frozen in happier days. A young man with strong shoulders and a gentle smile. A woman with soft eyes and neatly braided hair. And a child, no older than 6 or 7, with a grin so wide it lit up his tiny face. The sight hit Walter like a blow. He stepped closer, lantern trembling in his hands, as Scout sniffed the edges of the room cautiously. A table stood beneath the photographs, holding a stack of letters tied with a faded red ribbon, their corners curled, ink slightly blurred. Next to them lay a small wooden box, intricately carved with patterns Walter recognized instantly. Designs used by soldiers in Walter's old unit as keepsakes or gifts, handmade during long deployments to remind themselves of home. His breath caught. Only one man he knew had carved boxes like that, his old friend Thomas Reed. Memories crashed into him. Dusty tent floors, sandstorms howling outside, nights spent talking quietly about the dreams they'd chase after the war. Walter remembered Thomas showing him how to carve those exact patterns, laughing softly as he said he was making a box for his son, little Danny, so the boy would have something to remember him by when he was older. Walter remembered Thomas's voice cracking with the words, "Promise me, Walt, if anything ever happens to me, tell my boy I never stopped thinking about him." It was a promise Walter had carried for decades, heavy, impossible, because Thomas had died in Walter's arms, during a firefight their unit never fully recovered from. Walter had searched after the war, tracked every lead, tried to find the boy, but poverty, grief, and relocation had made the Reed family vanish from public records. Walter eventually assumed the child had grown up somewhere out there, unaware that a stranger had once held his father's last words like a sacred duty. But here, in this hidden underground room, the truth lingered in every object. Walter reached for one of the photographs and brought it closer to the lantern. His chest tightened. The child, Danny, looked so full of life. The mother's eyes, though bright in the photograph, carried a flicker of something Walter now recognized: fear, sorrow, loss waiting to happen. He placed the photo down with trembling hands and opened the stack of letters, reading the first few lines slowly, reverently. They were written by the mother to Thomas, telling him how she missed him, how Danny asked for him every night, how the world felt cold without him. Then the letters shifted. The handwriting grew unsteady. Danny had fallen ill. The doctors tried, but the illness spread fast. The mother's words tangled with grief. By the next letter, the child was gone, and the mother, unable to bear the weight of 2 ghosts, had sealed their memories in this underground room before walking away forever. Walter felt something inside him fracture. Scout pressed against his leg, sensing the pain radiating off him. The old veteran sank onto a crate, lantern resting at his feet, as tears filled his eyes. Tears for Thomas, for Danny, for the mother who had carried her own grief into oblivion, and for the promise Walter had tried so hard to keep long after it had become impossible. It felt as though fate had brought him here not by accident but by design, guiding his steps to the one place where the story he thought he'd failed could finally be understood. He lifted the wooden box with shaking hands, opened it slowly, and stared at the tiny shoes, the toy soldier, the hospital bracelet with Danny's name etched faintly into the plastic. Each item was a heartbreak preserved through time, a reminder of love and loss so deep it refused to fade. Walter closed his eyes, letting the overwhelming sorrow wash over him, while Scout laid his head on the veteran's knee, grounding him with a loyalty that needed no words. The underground room was not just a forgotten space. It was a time capsule of unfinished goodbyes, a place that needed someone to witness it, someone who understood what it meant to carry a promise through decades of silence. And Walter knew, with a clarity that shook him, that Scout had led him here because some stories refused to stay buried forever. For hours, Walter sat in the dim underground room, lantern glow trembling against the dirt walls. the air thick with the weight of unspoken stories and memories that had waited decades to be found. Scout stayed pressed against his leg the entire time, his steady presence grounding Walter as wave after wave of realization crashed through him. It wasn't just grief that flooded his chest, it was the overwhelming understanding that everything he believed about his failed promise to Thomas Reed had been built on an absence of truth. He had spent years imagining the life Thomas's son might have lived, believing the child had grown into adulthood somewhere in the world, carrying his father's features and maybe even a few of his habits. Walter had pictured him learning to ride a bike, graduating school, maybe becoming a father himself one day. He had clung to those hopeful imaginings as a way to balance the guilt of not being able to reach the boy sooner. But all of those imagined futures, all those mental snapshots, evaporated in the stillness of this cramped hidden chamber. Danny had been gone almost as long as Thomas. The family Walter had searched for had already been lost, their lives sealed beneath a floorboard that no one else had thought to lift. As Walter traced the edge of the wooden box with a trembling finger, he felt as if he were holding the fragile remains of a dream that had never been allowed to grow. And yet, beneath the sorrow, something deeper stirred. Not closure, but a strange and quiet understanding, as though fate had not brought him here to undo the past, but to witness it, honor it, and finally lay it to rest. He took the hospital bracelet into his hand again, squinting at the faded lettering, imagining the small, fragile wrist it once encircled. Scout nudged his shoulder gently, sensing another swell of emotion before it even rose fully. Walter closed his eyes, inhaling a shaky breath as he leaned his head back against the dirt wall. "I'm sorry, Thomas," he whispered into the heavy stillness, voice cracking beneath the weight of decades. "I tried. God knows I tried." The silence answered him, not with coldness, but with something almost peaceful, as if the room itself acknowledged his words. Walter wiped his eyes with the corner of his sleeve, regaining his composure enough to look around again. His gaze drifted back to the photographs lining the wall, time-frozen moments that showed the Reed family in happier times, unaware of how short their world would be. The child's grin haunted him the most. It reminded him of the young soldiers he'd watched march into battle with bright eyes and naive hope, unaware of the pain waiting for them. Walter stepped closer, lantern raised, examining each photograph with reverence. There was one of the three of them sitting on the porch of this very shack, before decay crawled up the walls, before loss hollowed it out. The mother had her arms wrapped tightly around Danny, Thomas standing behind them with a protective hand resting on her shoulder. They looked so whole then, so untouched by tragedy. Walter touched the edge of the frame lightly, feeling the roughness of old wood beneath his fingertips. He wondered what had driven the mother to bury everything down here. Had she hoped someone would one day find it? Or had she meant for these memories to remain hidden forever, locked away with her grief? Walter's mind drifted, imagining her descending the same narrow steps he had, placing each object with trembling care, sealing the room with one last look before turning away from everything she loved. He felt a profound sympathy for her, a woman who had lost her husband to war and her child to illness within a span of months, left alone in a world that had taken too much from her. Perhaps she had bought this shack as her own form of retreat, hoping its solitude would numb the pain. Perhaps when even that wasn't enough, she abandoned it, unable to keep living surrounded by ghosts. That thought pulled Walter's heart in two directions: sorrow for her lonely suffering, and admiration for the strength it must have taken to move on, even if moving on meant disappearing entirely. He stepped back toward the table, eyes falling again on the stack of letters tied with ribbon. He untied them slowly, unfolding one after another. The inked words revealed a woman whose love never wavered, even as her world collapsed. Her final letter, the one she'd never sent, was addressed not to Thomas, but to Danny. It was short, written with shaking hands. Walter read it in the flickering lantern light. "When the world feels too heavy, remember that you were loved with everything I had left. The words squeezed Walter's chest until he had to sit down again. Scout rested his head in the old man's lap, letting out a quiet sigh that seemed to fill the room with gentle reassurance. Walter stroked the dog's fur absent-mindedly, lost in the whirlwind of emotions. He knew, with chilling clarity, that this room had been waiting for someone. Not just anyone, but someone who understood loss the way soldiers do. Someone who could stand in the middle of these relics and not turn away. Someone like him. He felt the responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a calling. The world had forgotten the Reed family. Records had been erased, memories scattered, graves unmarked. But here, beneath his own fragile shack, their story had been preserved in a silence that demanded to be honored. For a long moment, Walter stared at the wooden box in his lap, then at the letters, then at the photographs, realizing the weight of what Scout had led him to. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a legacy, a last piece of a family that had vanished too soon. The lantern flickered, casting a wavering glow over the room, and Walter knew that leaving everything here as it was would be wrong. These memories were no longer just the remnants of a lost family. They had become a part of his story now, intertwined with the promise he once made beneath a hail of gunfire. He couldn't change the past, but he could ensure the Reed family was remembered. Scout nudged his cheek with a soft whine, urging Walter to rise. And with one final look around the underground chamber, Walter understood the truth fully. This wasn't a place of sorrow. It was a place of remembrance, and fate had led him here so that the silence of these forgotten lives would finally be broken. The storm rolled in before dusk, a slow-moving wall of gray that thickened the sky like an old wound reopening. But Thomas barely noticed it as he sat on the edge of the cot in the shack, hands clasped, shoulders hunched, listening to the restless breaths of Ranger who lay beside him. Hours had passed since he uncovered the final photograph, the one with the child's handwriting on the back, and something inside him had been shifting, unwinding, unraveling. His heart felt heavier than it ever had in war, in hospitals, in the long silence of civilian life. Yet here, in a shack abandoned by memory and time, he faced a pain he didn't know how to name. Ranger's head rested on Thomas's boot. Every so often the old dog would look up, brown eyes soft, as if urging him to breathe, urging him not to retreat into the dark place he knew too well. But Thomas had spent a lifetime running from certain ghosts, and now he was staring one directly in the face. The diary lay open on the crate beside him, its pages rippled from moisture and age. He read the same lines again and again, each one carving deeper into him. He won't wake up. I don't understand why. I don't know what to do. I'm scared to be alone. A child had written those words in this very shack, living through moments no one should ever have faced alone. Thomas imagined her small hands gripping the pencil, her breath shaking, her father lying behind her, unconscious from illness or injury, and the world outside offering nothing but cold wind and solitude. The thought pressed on his chest until he had to lean forward, elbows on knees, head in hands. He tried to picture the man, the veteran whose belongings were scattered like echoes through the shack, and wondered if he too had once sat where Thomas was sitting, wondering how everything had gone wrong. The storm outside began tapping against the loose boards, gentle at first, then heavier as the wind picked up. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching, sensing the shift. Thomas reached down automatically and stroked the dog's fur, grounding himself in the familiar warmth. "It's okay," he whispered, though the words were meant as much for himself as for Ranger. A deep breath steadied him, and he turned another page in the diary. More entries, more fear, more loneliness. But near the end, the handwriting changed, shakier, slower, as if written by an older hand. "If someone finds this, please know I tried. I tried to keep her warm. I tried to call for help. I tried to stay awake." The final entry ended mid-sentence, the ink trailing off like a life interrupted. Thomas closed the diary gently, reverently, as though it were something sacred. In a way, it was, a relic of a tragedy lost to the world, tucked away in a shack no one had cared about for decades. He felt a flicker of anger. Anger at the world for forgetting these people, for letting their story fade behind peeling paint and dust. But beneath that anger was a deeper emotion, one he rarely allowed himself to feel: responsibility. Not the responsibility of command or duty, but something softer, more personal. He had stumbled into their lives by accident, but now he felt compelled to carry their story forward, to ensure it wasn't lost again. Thunder cracked in the distance, rolling across the sky, and rangers stood up, pacing in short, anxious circles. Thomas rose as well, joints stiff from sitting so long. The shack creaked around them, the wind forcing its way through uneven seams. He checked the door, then the window coverings he had propped earlier, securing them against the storm. As he worked, he spoke aloud to Ranger, his voice low, almost absent-minded. They were just like us, trying to survive, trying to hold on. Ranger nudged his leg gently, as if agreeing. The light outside dimmed further, turning the interior of the shack into a muted canvas of shadows. Thomas turned on his lantern, its soft glow spreading across the dusty floorboards. It illuminated the scattered objects: the torn jacket, the rusted lockbox, the drawing done by a child who never grew up. He walked over to it, kneeling carefully. The drawing showed a smiling girl standing beside a man holding her hand. Above them, a shaky sun had been drawn with rays stretching outward like hopeful fingers. Something about the simplicity of it hit Thomas harder than everything else combined. Innocence captured on crinkled paper, preserved decades longer than the lives it represented. He swallowed hard. She loved him, he murmured, and he loved her. You can see it. The realization wasn't profound or complex, but it struck him all the same. Love had existed here, even in the midst of desperation and isolation. Love had kept them warm for as long as it could, and then the world had simply moved on. A sudden gust rattled the entire shack, snapping Thomas from his thoughts. He looked toward the back wall where Ranger had gone earlier, the place where the floorboards had concealed the diary in the photograph. Something about that section of the shack felt different now, heavier, almost expectant. Thomas approached slowly, the lantern casting flickering shadows around him. Ranger padded beside him, tail low, sniffing the wood again with a soft whine. Thomas knelt, running his fingers along the floorboards, feeling the uneven edges, the slight give beneath his weight. He pressed harder, and the board shifted just enough to confirm what his instincts had been whispering since he first uncovered the items. "There's more," he breathed. And as lightning flashed outside, lighting the shack in a brief burst of ghostly white, Thomas braced himself for what else these forgotten walls might reveal. Because the story wasn't over, not yet, and somewhere deep in the floor, something waited to be brought back into the light. The storm raged into the night, as though it had been waiting years for an excuse to break the silence around the shack. But inside, beneath the trembling beams and the soft circle of lantern light, Thomas knelt with a steady stillness. Ranger hovered beside him, tail low, ears angled forward, sensing that whatever they were about to uncover would change something inside his old master. The loose floorboard lifted more easily this time, as if time itself had grown tired of hiding secrets. Thomas grasped the edge and pulled it back, exposing the darkness beneath. The smell of earth and age rose faintly, and he lowered the lantern to peer inside. What lay within wasn't treasure or weapons or anything dramatic. It was something far more human. A small metal tin, dented at the corners, lay buried under a layer of dust. Beside it was a crumpled cloth bundle tied with thick thread. Thomas lifted them both carefully, his hands trembling with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He carried them to the crate where the diary rested and sat down slowly, Ranger lying at his feet with a soft groan. Outside, the thunder tapered off, replaced by a steady drumming of rain that sounded almost like distant applause, as if the world understood the gravity of this moment. Thomas opened the tin first. Inside were several folded papers, a tarnished locket, and something that made him pause: A pair of tiny dog tags, much smaller than standard military ones, engraved with a child's name. He traced the letters lightly with his thumb. His breath caught. He hadn't expected something so intimate, so fragile. Beneath the tags was a faded note, its edges brittle. Thomas unfolded it slowly, squinting at the smeared ink until the words emerged. "If anyone finds this, please take care of her. She deserves more than this world gave me." The signature wasn't a name, just a trembling mark, as though the writer had been too weak to finish. Thomas inhaled sharply, the weight of the father's plea settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He set the note aside with reverence and reached for the cloth bundle. Untying the thread, he revealed a set of small belongings: a wooden toy carved into the shape of a rabbit, painted once but now chipped, a little glove too small for any adult hand, and a slip of paper with a child's drawing of a dog. Thomas stared at the drawing for a long moment. The dog was smiling, tail wagging, standing beside the same little girl who appeared in the other picture. The sun was drawn above them again, but this time it had fewer rays, as if the child had been tired or sad when she made it. He felt something deep inside him twist, a familiar ache he thought he had buried years ago. His own memories rose unbidden, faces he had lost, voices he couldn't remember clearly anymore, the hollow feeling of watching people slip away while he remained. War had left scars he never talked about, not even to Ranger. But this was a wound of a different kind. This was a family left alone in the dark, fighting a battle no one saw, and losing quietly. He felt a surge of sorrow for them, but also something else, something bright and painful and necessary. A sense that he had found this place for a reason, that he had been guided here not by chance, but by the quiet pull of unfinished stories. Ranger nudged his hand gently, sensing the shift in his breathing. Thomas looked down at the dog, and for the first time in days he managed a small smile. "You found all this, you know?" he whispered. "You brought me here." Ranger wagged his tail once, slow but proud. Thomas set the items back on the crate, then stood and walked to the window where the storm had softened into a misty drizzle. The clouds were still heavy, but hints of moonlight flickered through them. He rested a hand against the frame, thinking. What was he supposed to do now? Leave everything behind? Pretend he had seen nothing? He knew he couldn't. The diary, the drawings, the plea etched into shaking handwriting, all of it begged for acknowledgement, for dignity, for someone to care. And in the quiet of the shack, surrounded by memories that weren't his but felt like they could have been, Thomas made a decision he didn't say aloud. He didn't have to. The determination settling in his chest was enough. He spent the next hours gathering every piece of the family's story, placing them gently into a clean wooden box he found near the back wall. The lock on the box was broken, so he tied it shut with rope and wrapped it in a blanket to protect it from moisture. Ranger watched him tirelessly, head tilting with curiosity. When Thomas finished, he knelt beside the dog and scratched behind his ears. "We'll take this into town tomorrow," he said softly. "Someone needs to know what happened here. They deserve their names back." Ranger licked his hand, sealing the promise. As dawn approached, the rain softened into a thin mist drifting across the land. The storm clouds broke apart like old armor falling away, and the first pale light of morning crept through the cracks of the shack. Thomas felt a calm he hadn't known in years. Not happiness, not relief, but a quiet sense of direction. He wasn't leaving the past here. He was carrying it with him, giving it a chance to be seen again. He stepped outside, with Ranger close behind, the wet earth soft beneath their boots and paws. The shack stood behind him, weathered but no longer abandoned, not truly. He turned back once, staring at the crooked roof and sagging porch, and lifted a hand in a silent farewell. Then he started walking toward the distant line of trees, Ranger trotting faithfully beside him, the box secured under his arm. The morning breeze brushed against them, cool and clean, as if the world itself were acknowledging the weight Thomas now carried. Somewhere inside him, the ache was still there, but different, lighter, steadier, transformed into something like purpose. The story that had been buried in that shack was no longer forgotten. It lived on in him now, in the man who had once come seeking solitude and instead found a family's final cry for remembrance. As they walked together toward the road, Thomas realized something quietly profound. Sometimes the heart breaks not to wound, but to awaken. And sometimes the things we find in the most broken places aren't reminders of loss, but reminders of why we're still here, why we keep going, why we choose to care despite everything. Ranger nudged his leg again, and Thomas smiled at the old dog, the companion who had led him into the darkest part of another family's past and, in doing so, lit a small flame inside his own. They walked on, carrying the memory of those who could no longer speak for themselves, with the sunlight slowly rising behind them, warming the path ahead.